There's a misunderstanding in modern culture that if someone senses something is wrong before there is visible evidence, they must be paranoid, dramatic, or emotionally overreactive. If they say a relationship is shifting while everything still looks fine on the surface, they must be inventing problems. If they withdraw from a room before anyone else notices the tension in it, they must be too sensitive to function in ordinary life. But that assumption reveals more about the culture than it does about the person being judged. Because for many empaths, this early recognition is not anxiety and it is not imagination. It is often the opposite. It can be the quiet signal of a mind that has spent decades reading what others only encounter in hindsight. And this is where psychology becomes interesting. Most people have been conditioned to believe that perception only becomes valid once it can be proven that a feeling does not count unless someone else agrees with it. That intuition is merely emotion dressed up in borrowed authority. And modern culture, in its obsession with data and verification, has only deepened this bias. If you cannot explain it, it must not be real. If you cannot show the evidence, it must not be happening. If no one else sees it yet, it cannot possibly be there. And so a certain kind of person gets quietly dismissed across their entire life. The one who senses the undercurrent, the one who feels the shift before it becomes a situation. The one who speaks cautiously about something nobody else has noticed and is told again and again that they are seeing things that are not there. But what most people miss is that they were not seeing things that were not there. They were seeing things that were not there yet. There is a specific kind of empath for whom this recognition becomes unusually sharp. They are sometimes described gently and without ceremony as empaths with older souls. The phrase is imprecise, but it points to something real. It describes a person whose inner age seems to outrun their outer biography. Someone who has always felt, quietly, that they were arriving at conclusions the rest of the room was still walking toward. They do not announce this, they rarely claim it. In fact, they often spend the first half of life wondering what is wrong with them, because their perception keeps outpacing everyone around them, and no one in their life seems to understand why. It looks like overthinking, but it is actually pattern recognition refined across decades of feeling what others refuse to feel. That distinction matters, because overthinking is repetitive and anxious, while pattern recognition is quiet and patient. Overthinking runs in circles. Recognition moves in straight lines towards something that has not yet been named. And the empath with an older soul is almost never running in circles. They are simply arriving early. Recognition deepens in stillness. Discernment deepens in stillness. Accuracy deepens in stillness. And stillness, for most of the modern world, has become unbearable. People no longer trust the signals that arrive without sound because they have been trained to wait for announcements. But the empath with an older soul has never needed the announcement. They feel the signal at the frequency it originally travels. And they have carried that ability so long and been corrected for it so often that they often assume everyone else must sense these things too. The shock of their life is discovering that most people do not. Many empaths with older souls understand this intuitively by the time they reach the middle chapters of their lives. They begin to notice a recurring shape to their experience. They sense something is off with a person, and months later, the truth of that person becomes visible to everyone. They feel a friendship ending long before the friendship acknowledges itself. They recognize an unspoken dynamic inside a room and carry that recognition silently while the people inside the dynamic continue performing the opposite. This is not mysticism, it is the quiet compounding of a lifetime of emotional attention, a lifetime of watching what others dismissed, a lifetime of listening to what others talked over, a lifetime of holding a knowing that was consistently unwelcome. Because if a person has been reading emotional reality their entire life, why would anyone expect them to suddenly stop reading it now? Once you understand that these empaths are not predicting but perceiving, a deeper question emerges. What exactly are they seeing that everyone else is missing? And why does it seem to reach them first? This is not heightened sensitivity in the ordinary sense. This is not simply feeling more. This is a particular kind of attention that has been trained, refined, and calibrated across years of emotional experience, and it produces recognitions that look impossible to anyone who has not lived inside that attention. The first of these recognitions tends to be the same across nearly every empath with an older soul. They sense dishonesty before words confirm it. Not the obvious kind, not the lies anyone can catch. The older, quieter dishonesty that lives in tone, in timing, in the fractional delay between a question and its answer. Most people wait to be shown. The empath with an older soul has stopped waiting because they have learned that the signal always arrived first and the evidence always arrived late. It looks like suspicion, but it is actually discernment. And the difference between those two is the difference between an exhausted mind and a quietly accurate one. Suspicion searches for danger. Discernment simply notices what is already present. Suspicion colors everything with fear. Discernment colors nothing. It only sees. And that is why the empath with an older soul rarely confronts the dishonesty they perceive. They do not need to. They have already adjusted internally long before anyone else has even begun to suspect what they already know. The second recognition is equally quiet. They feel endings before the ending arrives, a closeness that has begun to hollow out, a conversation that has lost its inner warmth while still using the same outer words, a chapter of life that is finishing, even though nothing external has yet changed. And this is perhaps the loneliest of their perceptions, because endings take time to reveal themselves in the visible world. So the empath with an older soul often grieves in advance. They mourn the fading of something, while the people around them still believe everything is intact. And when the ending finally becomes undeniable to everyone else, the empath has already moved through the hardest part. People often misread this as coldness. It is not coldness, it is grief completed in private, long before grief became publicly acceptable. There is a third recognition, and this one is more difficult to explain, but perhaps the most defining of them all. They recognize the difference between performative love and real love almost instantly. Not through words, through the architecture of the interaction, through the way a person listens when there is no audience, through the texture of presence when nothing is being asked and nothing is being offered. Because performative love behaves well in front of witnesses. Real love behaves consistently whether witnesses exist or not. And the empath with an older soul has watched enough of both to know the signature of each. Here's what most people miss. These recognitions are not occasional insights. They are the empath's baseline experience of reality. They live inside this perception every day, all day, whether they are welcomed inside it or not. And for a long time, they assume this is simply how everyone moves through the world. Only slowly, over years, do they begin to realize that most people genuinely do not see what they see. That is when a specific kind of loneliness sets in. Not the loneliness of being alone, the loneliness of perceiving clearly in a world that rewards not perceiving at all. But here's the paradox. The very quality that has made their life more difficult is also the quality that has quietly protected them. Because an empath with an older soul does not walk into the same situations most people walk into. Their inner alarm has always been ahead of their outer life. And while they sometimes wish they could unsee what they see, the seeing itself has kept them from countless forms of harm they will never fully know they avoided. It looks like excessive caution, but it is actually an early warning system developed from an early age. This leads to the fourth recognition. They sense motive beneath kindness, not always, not paranoidly, but often enough that they have learned to feel the small difference between generosity given freely and generosity offered with quiet expectation attached. Most people cannot tell these apart until the expectation becomes a demand. The empath with an older soul feels the expectation inside the offering and feels it immediately. This perception has saved them more than once. It has also isolated them more than once, because when a kindness carries a hidden motive and they decline it, they often look ungrateful to people who are only watching the surface. They have learned to accept this. They have learned that being misunderstood is a small price for being accurate. And then there is the fifth, and it is perhaps the most tender. They perceive when someone is losing themselves, slowly, invisibly, in a relationship, in a job, in a family dynamic, in the slow erosion of a life once lived with color. Before the person losing themselves notices, before the people around that person notice, the empath with an older soul sees the dimming as it is happening in real time, and the kindness with which they carry this seeing without confronting, without forcing, without breaking the dignity of the person who is not yet ready to face it, is one of the quietest forms of love on this earth. Many empaths understand this kind of love without ever naming it. They have held it for others for so long that they have forgotten it is a form of love at all. They have simply learned to hold what others cannot yet hold for themselves. They have become the keeper of truths that cannot yet be spoken. And in a culture that rewards speed, reaction, and immediate verdict, their slower, more patient way of seeing often goes completely unnoticed. They do not mind. They have never needed to be noticed for their perception. They only needed the perception to be real, and it has always been real, whether anyone else believed it or not. There's another layer most people overlook, and this is where the psychology becomes even deeper, because the older-souled empath does not arrive at these recognitions effortlessly. There is a cost, there is always a cost, and the cost is where the deeper understanding begins. Every one of these perceptions was forged inside an experience that most people would never willingly revisit. The sensing of dishonesty was not born in a safe environment. It was born somewhere a child or a younger version of themselves learned that words did not match actions and that survival required reading the silence underneath the speech. The feeling of endings in advance was not born inside a life of secure attachment. It was born in a life where important people left without explanation, or stayed physically while leaving emotionally, and a younger heart had to learn to feel what was happening beneath the appearance of intactness. The ability to distinguish performative love from real love was not a gift. It was a lesson taught by watching performative love dress itself in the language of real love and mislead them for years before the truth arrived. This is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Perception this precise is almost always the fingerprint of a person who was not protected in the ways a soul is meant to be protected. Someone who, at some earlier stage of life, had to do the emotional work that the adults around them should have been doing. Someone who learned to read rooms because the rooms themselves were unsafe. Someone who learned to feel the ending before the ending because experience taught them that the people who love you do not always stay, and the ones who stay do not always love you. That is the hidden architecture of older-souled empathy. It is built not from ease, but from encounter. Not from absence of pain, but from pain that was felt all the way through rather than pushed away. The empath with an older soul did not choose this perception. The perception chose them because life placed them in circumstances where they either developed this kind of seeing or they did not survive intact. And here is where a quiet shift begins to happen in midlife and beyond. The recognitions that once felt like burdens begin to feel like inheritance. Not an inheritance anyone would have requested, but an inheritance nonetheless, because the empath who once felt cursed by their perception begins to understand that every painful chapter of their life has converted itself slowly and silently into a kind of quiet fluency in human nature that most people never develop. A fluency that cannot be taught in any book. A fluency that only comes from having been through what the book is describing. It looks like hypervigilance, but it is actually earned wisdom. And once you have seen earned wisdom in someone, you recognize it instantly everywhere else. It has a particular gentleness, a particular patience, a particular unwillingness to judge others for failing to see what took the empath decades of suffering to finally see themselves, because the empath with an older soul remembers being on the other side of the recognition. They remember being the one who did not see. And that memory makes them kind in a way that only kindness born from former blindness can be. This is the part people misread most. They see the quiet, they see the distance, they see the way the older-souled empath no longer reacts to things that used to wound them. And they assume this person has become hardened. But hardened people do not weep when they see a stranger being dismissed. Hardened people do not stop in the middle of a crowded day to feel for someone they will never meet again. Hardened people do not hold truth silently for others out of respect for a timing that is not yet right. The older-souled empath does all of these things. What has changed is not their tenderness. What has changed is where their tenderness is spent. And a person whose tenderness is spent wisely is not hardened. They are whole. And if any of this is landing with a kind of specificity that feels strangely personal, if you are recognizing a lifetime of small moments you could never quite explain, you are likely not reading this as information. You are recognizing something that has been true of you for a very long time, something that perhaps nobody in your life has ever been able to name back to you with the exact words you needed. because there is one more thing about the empath with an older soul that is rarely spoken. They do not need to be right about what they perceive. That is not the point. Many of them could live an entire life without ever being validated, because the perception itself has become its own form of companionship. A quiet knowing that they are not crazy. A quiet knowing that the thing they feel is real, even if it never becomes visible to anyone else. A quiet knowing that they have always been seeing accurately, even when they were told for decades that they were not. And once you understand that older-souled perception is not a gift handed down, but a fluency earned through living, and that its cost has already been paid in full, a final truth reveals itself, one that reframes the entire weight of that journey. Nothing they perceive now is borrowed. Nothing they know now is theoretical. Nothing they feel now is secondhand. Every recognition they carry was purchased by an earlier version of themselves who did not yet know why they were paying so much. And the empath with an older soul eventually comes to understand that their current clarity is not separate from that earlier pain. It is the same thing, metabolized. The pain did not go away. It became vision. The confusion did not disappear. It became discernment. The wounds did not vanish. They became the very instruments through which this person now reads the world with a precision most people will never possess. This is where the quiet strength finally takes a recognizable shape. Because the empath with an older soul stops apologizing for their perception. They stop softening their knowing to make other people comfortable. They stop doubting what they sense simply because others have not yet sensed it. They no longer wait for consensus to believe themselves. They no longer require external confirmation to trust the signal that arrives before the evidence. That shift is not arrogance, it is the end of a very long negotiation with doubt. And when that negotiation finally ends, something begins that can only be called sovereignty. They no longer need to prove what they see. They no longer need to convince those committed to misunderstanding them. They no longer need to dim their perception to fit inside rooms that were never built for their clarity. They no longer need to explain why they felt something before it became visible. They no longer need to defend an accuracy that was never the problem to begin with. That is freedom, real freedom. The freedom of no longer performing ignorance to preserve the comfort of people who prefer a version of you that sees less than you actually see. And this freedom changes the shape of their relationships. It changes the shape of their conversations. It changes the shape of the rooms they are willing to remain inside. They become more selective, not because they have grown cold, but because they have grown honest. They invite fewer people into the full depth of their knowing because they have finally understood that depth offered casually becomes depth misused. They have learned that perception, like any sacred thing, belongs only where it will be received with care. And they have made peace with the fact that most of the world will never receive it that way, and that this is not a failure of their perception, but a feature of the world. The empath with an older soul eventually stops explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand that the people who need the explanation will not accept it, and the people who understand without explanation do not require one. That realization alone will change a life. It removes the endless effort of translation. It returns a person to themselves in a way nothing else quite does. And here's the paradox that rarely gets spoken. The empath with an older soul is often thought to be lonely because they see more than most, but the deeper truth is that they have become, over time, excellent company for themselves. They have spent so long inside their own perception that the inside of their own mind has become one of the most trustworthy places they know. That is a kind of companionship very few people ever develop. It is the companionship of a self that has survived its own experience and has come out the other side still intact, still perceiving, still kind. What looks like seeing too much is actually seeing on time. What looks like arriving too early is actually arriving when arrival was required. What looks like feeling what others do not feel is actually feeling what everyone eventually feels, only decades before they are ready to. What looks like an unusual sensitivity is actually an unusual fidelity to truth, and what looks like an old soul is, in the end, simply a soul that has refused to pretend it has not already lived through what it has already lived through. That is wisdom, that is the shape of it. And perhaps the most important thing an older-souled empath eventually realizes is that they were never supposed to be understood by everyone. Their perception was never meant to be a public offering. It was always meant to be a private inheritance, carried quietly, used gently, shared rarely, and honored inwardly. The moment they accept that, something inside them settles that has not been settled for a very long time. A lifetime of explanation ends, a lifetime of minimizing ends, a lifetime of wondering whether something was wrong with them ends. And what remains is the quiet version of themselves that was always underneath everything, the one who has always been right, the one who has always seen, the one who has always known. Recognizing what others cannot yet see is not a burden. It is the quiet proof that a soul has already lived through what it now understands.